Snow was falling thickly on Beacon Hill when Clara Whitaker was pushed out of her own house like a forgotten object. The iron gate creaked, her purse hit the step, and she nearly slipped, feeling the ice tear at her fingers beneath her thin gloves. Behind her, the mansion's warm lights burned like a mockery. Inside, laughter and the clinking of glasses confirmed that the family was complete, except for the daughter who, that night, would be erased from the portrait. Gregory grabbed the doorknob and said it was best for everyone, that she was weak, useless, a burden the inheritance couldn't carry. Thomas, with his impeccable coat and the watch inherited from his father, nodded without looking back. Clara tried to say she had nowhere to go, that her parents would never have allowed it, but the door closed slowly, as if the house itself decided to erase her from its memory. The wind bit her skin, and she hugged the cheap bag, remembering her mother, urging her to be kind, even when the world wasn't, remembering her father telling her that character is proven in silence. In that moment, in the middle of the icy street, none of it seemed enough. The neighborhood watched from behind the curtains like someone watching an unpleasant spectacle they couldn't take their eyes off. A car drove by, throwing dirty snow on Clara's shoes. Another braked slowly to check if she needed help, but continued on when it realized this was a rich person's business. Pride kept her from crying. She grabbed her suitcase, crossed the street, and went down the steps of the brownstone she'd rented from a friend who was traveling. The emergency key was still in the vase in the entryway, and that was how she spent the night, curled up on the couch, listening to the mansion breathe in the distance, remembering the sound of the fireplace, the smell of hot chocolate in winters gone by, her father's voice calling his 3 children to the table. The clock ticked like a weary old man, and as dawn began to break, the Boston skyline looked like cracked glass. Clara fell asleep exhausted, her bag at her feet and her coat damp, as if her entire life could fit into that rectangle of cheap fabric. At dawn, her fingers still ached and her head throbbed when someone knocked on the door. 3 firm, polite knocks, neither demanding nor pitying. Clara smoothed her hair with the palm of her hand and opened it. On the other side, a tall man with thin glasses and a dark overcoat introduced himself in a voice that knew exactly where he was going. He said his name was Andrew Cole, an attorney with the firm of Cole and Meredith, with offices on State Street, and that he came on behalf of the Suffolk County Probate Court. The envelope he carried bore the blue seal of the clerk's office and an intact red seal. It was no ordinary letter, no threatening note. It was something that required posture. Clara asked him to come in. The apartment smelled of dust and yesterday's coffee, and Andrew placed the envelope on the kitchen table, removing his gloves with the calm of someone who has weathered many storms without losing his bearings. He explained, with a gentleness that didn't sound condescending, that there were documents left by Henry and Eleanor Whitaker that hadn't been fully read at the time of their deaths. There was a clause that could only be opened upon a specific event, and that this event, recorded the night before by an anonymous caller and by footage from a street security, in camera, had finally occurred. Clara didn't understand. Andrew didn't smile. He said he needed to follow protocol and asked her to confirm her full name, her date of birth, and her former residence on Chestnut Street. She confirmed it with the voice of someone facing a tide. As the lawyer spoke, memories flashed back to the birthday when their mother insisted the brothers share the last piece of cake, the time their father took the 3 of them to see the grey sea at Marblehead and told them that no fortune was worth more than knowing who you are. Gregory had always absorbed words like the tricks of a beautiful speech. Thomas had learned to use them to sound decent when he needed to impress. Clara, who had listened more than she spoke, saved each sentence like someone collecting matches for a dark night. Now, standing in front of the envelope, the matches finally seemed useful. Andrew wiped the edge of the paper with his thumb, as if preparing a delicate instrument. He explained that the clause, technically an addendum, was confidential until one condition was met. If the youngest daughter were in any way expelled from the family home by her own siblings or prevented from residing there without just cause recognized by a competent authority, the document was to be presented to her, and only her, for immediate reading. Clara swallowed. She didn't ask why her parents had foreseen something so specific. She simply thought that if they had foreseen it, then they knew the darkness growing in the house while they were still alive. The lawyer studied her for a moment, as if gauging a patient's courage before surgery. He broke the seal with a chrome letter opener, making a short sound that made Clara's heart race. Inside were 2 typed pages and a third, handwritten by his mother, in a slanted script that Clara recognized instantly. Andrew took a deep breath and began reading the formal lines, mentioning registration numbers, dates, witnesses, the dry language of someone trying to tame fate with paragraphs. And then he moved on to the important part. He said the document dealt with the administration of assets and interests, the use of real estate, accounts not included in the public inventory, and a special note on final ownership should the addendum's condition be triggered. Clara's vision blurred for a moment. The world, which until then had been a series of closed doors, seemed to lean in to listen. Andrew read a few more lines in silence, his eyes darting as if searching for something he already knew was there. His skin lost a tone. The lawyer looked up and, without forcing solemnity, said he needed to confirm another piece of information. He asked if Clara remembered the old bank vault on Boylston, the one her father visited every 6 months. She said yes. She remembered the cold room, the heavy pen her father used to sign the form, the serious way he guarded documents like someone keeping promises. Andrew nodded slowly, turned the page, and fixed his finger on a line as if anchoring the boat at the exact spot before the storm. His voice dropped a notch. He explained that the addendum named a specific person as the ultimate owner of all shares and accounts linked to the vault, as well as real estate and rights associated with family trusts, effective immediately upon fulfillment of the condition. He explained that this was not a handout nor a posthumous kindness, but a complete and legally binding transfer bound by a web of clauses he himself had helped draft while Henry was still alive. And then, without metaphor, he looked at Clara and asked if she was ready to hear the name underlined on the next line. She nodded slightly. The kitchen clock struck a minute that felt like 3. Andrew tilted the paper, touched the line with the tip of his index finger, prepared his voice, and began to say the name that would change everything. Before the night everything fell apart, Clara Whitaker was remembered only as the youngest daughter of a family with a powerful Boston surname. The Whitakers owned Beacon Hill real estate, interests in shipping lines, and an inheritance passed down through generations like a scepter. Behind the velvet curtains and gala dinners, however, Clara always occupied the darkest corner of the table. While Gregory and Thomas were celebrated for their achievements in expensive schools and business trips, she was seen as the sensitive one, the dreamer, the one who spoke too softly and trusted too quickly. When her parents were alive, this label didn't carry as much weight. Henry and Eleanor balanced their children, reminding them that each had different but equally important values. After their sudden deaths, the balance shattered like a crystal. Gregory naturally assumed the position of boss, an heir who imitated his father's actions without possessing the same moral fiber. Thomas followed in his brother's footsteps, always in the shadows, supporting decisions that guaranteed his share of the fortune. Clara, who was still attending the Arts University in Cambridge, began to be treated like a guest in her own home. At every meeting with lawyers, she was reminded that her opinion was worth little. At every business dinner, she was introduced as the sweet youngest, but without a knack for numbers. Gradually, she learned to keep quiet, to avoid feeling ridiculous. There were, however, memories that stood like walls. Their childhood in the Chestnut Street garden, when Eleanor prepared picnics and forced her siblings to share every piece of cake equally. The day Henry took the 3 of them to Marblehead and, standing before the grey sea, said that the family fortune would only make sense if it was used to protect each other. Clara had believed those words more than her siblings. Perhaps that's why she suffered more when she realized that, without her parents, the promise had dissolved like sand through her fingers. Boston society, elegant and ruthless, contributed to the exclusion. At receptions, Clara was the target of veiled comments, so sweet but so naive. She didn't inherit the business acumen. She'll depend on her brothers forever. Even childhood friends, educated at private schools, they kept their distance, fearful of associating with someone who seemed increasingly out of place in their own home. Gregory encouraged these rumors, amused by painting Clara as a fragile piece on a steel board. Thomas just laughed, certain he would never have to get his hands dirty. In the solitude of her room, Clara collected sketchbooks and old notes from her mother. In each scribbled page, she sought a reflection of who she truly was, trying to preserve a space no one could invade. But the house, once her home, was becoming enemy territory. Doors closed before she entered. Decisions were made without her being consulted, and the feeling that she was about to be discarded grew stronger with each passing day. So, when the night of expulsion finally arrived, Clara was no longer surprised by her brother's venom. The shock wasn't in the gesture, but in the coldness with which it was carried out. To understand this past is to comprehend the depth of the wound. Clara hadn't just been torn from the mansion, she had been erased from her own family's narrative. What no one knew, not even she, was that beneath the veneer of exclusion, her parents had written another story, hidden in safes and papers, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Clara's expulsion wasn't a silent gesture made behind closed doors. It was a spectacle meticulously calculated by Gregory and Thomas to let the entire town know where their youngest sister belonged. That afternoon, as gala guests arrived for a cocktail party at the Whitaker mansion, Clara was summoned to the library under the pretense of signing pending documents. When she entered, she found the two siblings standing, glasses of whiskey in hand, papers arranged on the oak table. Their tones were formal, but their words carried the coldness of someone who had already made up their minds. Gregory, with that practiced smile, explained that her presence in the house was no longer possible, that her lack of direction and responsibility was a burden the family was unwilling to bear. Thomas, less eloquent, simply repeated that it was for the good of all. Clara tried to argue, reminding them that the house was still part of the inheritance, that it had as much right to remain there as they did. But Gregory laughed out loud, a laugh that seemed rehearsed to echo off the walls and hallways. He said there was no more room for sentimentality, that business required tough decisions, and that her loyalty had been in question since he refused to sign certain contracts they suggested. The accusation sounded absurd, but its intent was clear, to paint his sister as an obstacle, as dead weight. The scene quickly became public knowledge. Some guests, already settled in the hall, heard muffled screams coming from the library and watched as Clara was led to the front door, practically dragged. Gregory loudly announced to everyone that his sister was leaving the house of her own free will, to find her way. The words were spoken with false benevolence, but the glances exchanged between the guests revealed the truth. The image of Clara leaving with a small suitcase, her eyes brimming with tears and her posture erect, spread throughout the city in less than a day. In social circles, the episode was met with a mixture of shock and sarcasm. Some said Clara had finally shown her true face of failure. Others commented that the brothers had been too harsh. But in both cases, she was reduced to a secondary character, a footnote in a narrative the brothers skillfully controlled. Gregory fueled this narrative at subsequent dinners, insinuating that Clara couldn't handle responsibility, that she was incapable of managing even her own finances. Thomas, always in the dough, background, reinforced the insinuations with calculated silences. For Clara, the burden lay not only in the material exclusion, but in the public nature of the humiliation. It was as if her life had become a stage where her brothers wrote the script and society applauded without a care. With every whisper heard on the streets of Beacon Hill, the wound opened wider. With every sideways glance in cafes and bookstores, she felt branded with a label she hadn't chosen. The conflict wasn't just familial, it had become social. Clara wasn't just fighting against two brothers determined to erase her, but against an entire system of appearances that validated their version. It was as if she was surrounded by an invisible wall made of glances, rumors, and suppressed laughter. Increasingly isolated, she realized she had no allies in that circle. And at the same time, she felt the nascent strength of something she didn't yet understand, a discreet but resilient flame, like coal under the snow. The brothers' gesture wasn't just to expel her, it was to destroy her legitimacy forever. They believed that by removing her from the mansion in front of witnesses, they would eliminate any future possibility of challenge. Little did they know, however, that they had triggered the very condition their parents had foreseen in the sealed addendum. The moment Clara was thrown out into the street, fate began to turn against them. Silent, hidden, but inevitable. The day after the expulsion, the news was already circulating through Boston cafes like seasonal gossip. The gossip columns set the tone. Whitaker brothers reaffirm family leadership after difficult decision. Youngest child sets new course, seeking independence. The headlines, carefully nurtured by Gregory, painted Clara as someone who had chosen to leave, who didn't fit the profile required to maintain the empire. The paternalistic tone masked the violence of the previous night, but the printed words shaped collective perception. Among neighbors, the reaction was a mix of astonishment and veiled approval. Some, recalling years of parties and rejected invitations, commented that something like this was expected. Others, less involved, sighed in pity, but quickly changed the subject, fearing displeasing the more influential siblings. The image of Clara, alone on the street, suitcase in hand, had become a symbol of silent failure. Old school friends sent short messages, some filled with empty phrases. "I hope you're okay. If you need anything, I'll be around." None of them, however, offered to genuinely help. At the private receptions of Boston's elite, Clara was the subject of discreet conversation, described as too sweet to survive among wolves. Judgment was accompanied by condescending smiles and looks that mixed pity and contempt. The siblings, in turn, reinforced the narrative. Gregory appeared at charity events, declaring that he loved his sister but that she needed to find her own path, away from family pressure. Thomas confirmed this with calculated gestures, always in the background, always repeating that the decision had been inevitable. For the social circle, the official version was established. Clara had left voluntarily, but there were reactions beyond the brothers' control. Among the house's long-time employees, murmurs began to surface. Some recalled Clara's kindness as a child, the way she shared sweets in the kitchen, her habit of expressing gratitude for even the smallest gestures. A retired gardener confided to neighbors that the girl had always been the heart of the family and that the brothers would never understand. These whispers, though fragile, planted seeds of doubt. Meanwhile, Clara watched everything from the outside, almost like a spectator of her own story. She read the headlines with bitterness, recognizing the names of those who now reduced her to a footnote. She walked the streets with the sensation of carrying an invisible label on her forehead. She tried to lift her chin, but the weight of the voices was overwhelming. Social judgment was the second expulsion. The first was from the mansion, the second from the collective memory that defined who was relevant in the city and who wasn't. Clara finally understood that physical survival wasn't enough. She needed to reclaim something deeper, her own narrative, the right to exist without others writing her story for her. Clara settled into a small rented apartment in Cambridge, a two-room space with peeling walls and the smell of old paint. The makeshift mattress on the floor replaced the mansion's soft bed, and the cold crept in through the cracks in the windows as a constant reminder of what she had lost. Each night, the silence of the apartment seemed to shout louder than the laughter that echoed at her brother's parties. There were no servants to tidy her clothes, no dinners served on china, not even anyone to ask if she had eaten. There was only solitude, thick as the snow that accumulated outside. In the early days, she tried to convince herself it was just a phase. She tidied the space, hung improvised pictures made from magazine clippings, and made coffee in a dented kettle. But each gesture brought back a memory. Her mother arranging fresh flowers in the mansion's living room, her father running his hand through her hair before leaving for work, her two brothers ignoring her presence at dinner parties. Longing mixed with resentment, creating a wound. That wouldn't heal. At night, lying on the hard mattress, Clara relived the scene of her expulsion in vivid detail. The biting cold, Gregory's words spoken like a sentence, the way Thomas had looked away, unable to face his own cruelty. The echo of that door closing haunted her dreams, transforming them into recurring nightmares. She often woke gasping, tears streaming before she could even open her eyes. To cope, she sought refuge in her old sketchbooks. With each stroke, she tried to recapture the girl who believed in her parents' love, the young woman who dreamed of exhibiting her work in galleries. But the pencil trembled in her hands, as if the pain had robbed even her art of its steadfastness. There were days when she could barely stand. Her body felt like tons, and her mind repeated the cruel chorus of her brother's useless, dead weight with no future. Isolation also took its toll. Her old friends no longer called, and the few messages she received were filled with curiosity, disguised as concern. Clara could see the indifference behind the words, and it hurt even more. The world seemed to conspire to confirm her insignificance. Yet amidst this turmoil, there was an insistent flame. In the quietest hours, she remembered her father's repeated phrase, "Life tests our dignity when no one is looking." It made her sit on the edge of her bed and breathe deeply, even when everything around her seemed lost. The pain was real, overwhelming, but it was also fuel. Without realizing it, Clara began to transform each tear into a promise that one day, somehow, the weight of humiliation would not be her final mark. One grey morning, while Clara was still struggling to get out of bed, the doorbell echoed in the small apartment. Upon opening the door, she found Andrew Cole, the lawyer in the dark overcoat once again. He carried a weathered leather briefcase and a look that blended discretion and urgency. He asked to come in and bluntly explained that there was more than just the addendum delivered days earlier. There was an old safe registered in her father's name, which had remained untouched since his death. By protocol, it could only be accessed if certain family conditions were met. And now, after the public expulsion, those conditions had been met. Clara listened silently as he described the situation. The safe deposit box was in a bank branch on Boylston Street, locked and secured, waiting only for her presence. Andrew accompanied her there that same afternoon. The cold of the bank contrasted with the stifling heat of her chest, and when the metal box was opened, Clara could barely contain the trembling in her hands. Inside was a stack of documents, land deeds, stock certificates, and a smaller envelope handwritten by her mother in the delicate handwriting she had known since childhood. In the note, Eleanor said her daughter might face dark days, but she shouldn't doubt who she was. The lyrics spoke of trust, of dignity, of choices that needed to be made away from prying eyes. Between the words, Clara felt the embrace she so desperately needed, and along with the note came the paperwork that changed everything. Transfers and records in which her name appeared as the beneficiary of substantial assets, properties, and accounts that her siblings were completely unaware of. She closed her eyes, absorbing the revelation. There was no fanfare, no audience, just the silence of a vault and Andrew's calm presence as witness. It was in This silence that Clara realized, power didn't always emerge in grand scenes. Sometimes it grew like a seed hidden in the dark, waiting for the right moment to germinate. She decided she wouldn't say anything yet. She would guard the secret like one guarding a blade, sharp and invisible, ready to be used when the time called for it. In the following days, she returned to the simple routine of the apartment, but something inside her had changed. The weight of her grief hadn't lessened, but now there was a structure beneath her feet, a foundation that supported her. Each time she remembered her mother's words, she felt a new strength, subtle but real. Her brothers continued to parade at events, proud to be rid of her, unaware that, according to sealed documents and official records, Clara was already the true guardian of much of the fortune. It was a silent turnaround, without fireworks or applause, but powerful. While Gregory and Thomas celebrated their own arrogance, Clara understood that revenge didn't need to be shouted. All that was needed was to wait for the right moment for the truth, as inevitable as the sunrise, to illuminate what was hidden. The following weeks were marked by rumors of a large family meeting being called at the Boston Probate Court. Gregory and Thomas had requested a formal review of some disputed assets, confident that their sister's exclusion was solidified. For them, it would be merely a formality, an opportunity to reinforce to society that Clara no longer had a seat at the table. But when they entered the courtroom, they noticed something was off. Attorney Andrew Cole was already there, seated with his leather briefcase, and Clara sat serenely in the chair next to him, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The judge in charge opened the session by reminding them that there were pending documents from the Whitaker estate. Andrew stood, handed over a sealed envelope, and requested permission to read a specific section of the will. A murmur spread through the audience. Gregory frowned. Thomas crossed his arms, both uneasily. When Andrew began reading, the atmosphere in the room changed. The document spoke of an unexpected heir, someone to whom Henry and Eleanor Whitaker had entrusted the guardianship of assets under specific circumstances. The words were formal, but conveyed a clear intention. The parents knew that harmony between their children could collapse and, therefore, had left a mechanism to protect anyone who might be targeted by injustice. The text did not yet reveal a name, merely describing the condition. If any of the children were unjustly expelled from the family home, certain assets would automatically be assigned to the pretermitted heir. The silence in the room was absolute. Gregory tried to laugh it off, calling it a useless clause, a detail that wouldn't change anything. But the judge, serious, confirmed that the clause was valid and required a full review. Thomas, more cautious, began to sweat, realizing there was more at stake than he seemed. Clara, for her part, remained motionless. Inside, her heart was beating like a drum, but her face revealed nothing. Andrew didn't proceed with the full disclosure. He merely read to the part that described the activated condition. He said the rest should be examined in the next step after reviewing additional records. The effect, however, was already in effect. The audience was buzzing, reporters were frantically taking notes, and Gregory and Thomas's reputation was beginning to be questioned. After all, if their parents had felt the need to write such a clause, what did that say about their trust in them? For Clara, that moment was like feeling the first ray of sunlight pierce an endless night. It wasn't complete revelation, it wasn't yet victory, but it was enough to sow doubt, to shift perspectives, to tear away the label of invisibility. The siblings had constructed a narrative of fragility and weakness, but now they faced a shadow of uncertainty they couldn't control, and that simple detail was enough to begin to turn the tide. The partial reading fell upon the family like a thunderclap that never ends. As Gregory left the courthouse, he tried to force a smile and say, "Misunderstanding," but his voice faltered. Thomas, who had always preferred the comfort of the shadows, seemed smaller than his coat. Journalists fired questions that cut like stones, and for the first time since their parents' deaths, the brothers' narrative found no docile audience. The town, accustomed to accepting the Whitakers' official version, now savoured the possibility that power wasn't as tightly locked away as they claimed. The shock reverberated violently within the house. An aunt from Newport called in tears, demanding explanations and vowing that Eleanor would never allow such a nasty rift between her children. Old friends of Henry's, discreet former funders of cultural campaigns, wrote curt emails asking for urgent clarity about the family assets. The foundation bearing the Whitaker surname suspended a cocktail party until a new legal framework was established. And, as if the very stone of Chestnut Street sensed the crack, longtime employees glanced at each other in the hallways and closed doors at the sound of nervous footsteps. On the other side of the board, the enemies came out of hiding. Miranda Hale, a crisis management specialist, was hastily hired to protect the Whitaker brand. The strategy was predictable and dirty. Insinuate that Clara had an unstable emotional history, that she was impressionable, and that she could have been used by third parties for their own advantage. Victor Lang, a high-priced litigation lawyer with a razor-sharp smile, prepared petitions accusing Andrew Cole of a selective and theatrical reading of the will. In parallel, anonymous notes were circulated to society columnists, suggesting that Clara had always rejected family responsibilities. It was a classic crushing playbook, delegitimized the victim until the public mistook noise for truth. But the shock wasn't confined to the salons. In Back Bay cafes, groups discussed the case with the fervor of a final departure. At the Boston Harbor Bar, workers recalled that Henry Whitaker was respected for his fairness, and that if he had written a protection mechanism, there must have been a reason. On social media, photos of Clara as a child, found in local newspaper archives, began to reappear with captions asking why the youngest had always been erased. The condescending laughter of yesteryear gave way to a suspicious curiosity. Gregory reacted with controlled fury. He locked himself in his office, called successive meetings, and berated advisors who didn't have ready answers. He demanded that Victor find a way to block the complete opening of the attachments, requested expert examinations of signatures that were beyond doubt, and pressured the Boylston bank manager with late-night phone calls. Thomas, more practical, sought out the former butler to recall convenient statements. He offered money to confirm that Clara had fits. The butler, who cherished the memory of the girl who shared sweets with the kitchen, begged Thomas never to seek him out again. The "no," said in a low voice, left the second brother with a burning stomach. Clara observed the pandemonium with the tense calm of someone walking through a dark corridor holding matches. Andrew anticipated the adversaries' moves and secretly filed certified copies of the records found in the safe, along with affidavits from the bank attesting to dates and chain of ownership. Nothing was released to the press. There was no bravado. There was method. With each attempt at defamation, a documented response was sent to the notary's office, like silent bricks building a wall. The lowest blow came one freezing night when a tabloid published that Clara had dishonored her parents' memory out of greed, citing a source close to the family. The photos chosen showed her tired, leaving the courtroom. The intention was crystal clear: to implant the image of the unbalanced heiress, pushing her toward the usual caricature. The publication lasted only a few hours until a lawyer from the magazine itself, realizing the risk, changed the text to "open questions." The damage, however, was done, and Clara felt for a moment the temptation to respond in kind. She took a deep breath. Silence in this game was still her best weapon. The next day, the shock deepened when the judge notified the parties of a restraining order. Until the analysis was completed, the movement of certain assets would be frozen and the Chestnut Street residence would be preserved. It was a clear message that the court saw enough smoke to look for the fire. Gregory, upon hearing this, threw an expensive gift he had bought for an investor against the wall. Thomas drank too much and barely managed to hide his hangover at the morning meeting, Fissures appeared within Gregory's core group of allies. A Manhattan investor called Gregory and bluntly warned him that he wouldn't bet against a will written by Henry. A cousin who had been a regular visitor to the mansion posted, without naming names, a text about the danger of confusing leadership with domestic tyranny. Miranda, the consultant, recommended restraint and strategic humility, but was overwhelmed by the ego of someone who knew no restraint. Victor, pragmatic, began preparing a plan B. If the addendum couldn't be buried, at least its scope should be reduced. For Clara, each of these reactions was a mirror reflecting back to the brothers their own image. The shock of others didn't need to be managed by her, it was enough to be seen. And it was being seen, amplified by a town that has always respected well-written wills and families who honor their word. Andrew explained, without easy promises, that moments like these were precisely the ones that defined outcomes. Either the tide of opinion would consolidate in favor of the truth, or the cries of the powerful would once again cover the sand. As afternoon fell, when the Boston cold turned the sidewalks into a biting glare, Andrew received an email from the bank's compliance department with a sentence that, in itself, served as a flash of lightning. The retitlement of assets to the owner Clara E. Whitaker, prior to the death of Henry and Eleanor, is hereby confirmed, as per the terms attached. Below, it wasn't a victory, but it was the backbone. With the document in hand, the shock ceased to be merely a reaction and became an announcement. The entire city was still open-mouthed. It was a matter of hours until the next move. 2 days after the partial disclosure, the probate courtroom once again filled with journalists, onlookers, and silent allies. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone was awaiting an inevitable outcome. Judge McPherson opened the session with a firm voice, reminding everyone that the law does not bow to appearances, but to documents. Andrew Cole stood, presented the certified copies sent by the bank, and in front of everyone read the section that had remained hidden until then. The documents confirmed that, years before their deaths, Henry and Eleanor had transferred significant assets directly into Clara's name as a way to protect her from potential abuse. The clause requiring unfair expulsion had been met, and ownership was now complete. Gregory tried to intervene, his voice raised, accusing forgery. Thomas murmured that it was impossible, that his father would never have trusted his youngest daughter so much. But the signatures were there, notarized, date-stamped, and bank records indisputable. The judge declared without hesitation that until further notice, Clara Whitaker was the legal representative of a considerable portion of the inheritance, with voting rights on the boards of family companies. The repercussions were immediate. The authority, previously monopolized by the brothers, had changed hands. Outside, the press was reporting in real time. Whitaker's youngest daughter takes over family assets, the headlines read. The public, accustomed to seeing Clara as a shadow, now saw her as the protagonist of an unexpected drama. On the streets, talk spread. Some celebrated justice, others doubted her abilities. But everyone knew nothing would ever be the same again. Clara felt the shift in the air. It wasn't euphoria, nor was it immediate revenge. It was the realization that no matter how much they tried to erase her, there was something greater sustaining their position. She looked at her brothers and realized their fury stemmed not just from the loss of power, but from the humiliation of having been defeated by their own arrogance. Gregory trembled as he gripped the arm of his chair. Thomas hid his face in his hands. The reversal was clear. They no longer controlled the narrative. Behind the scenes, allies began to reposition themselves. Investors who had previously surrounded Gregory began calling Andrew, interested in understanding Clara's next steps. Discreet invitations poured in for private meetings, private dinners, and offers of support. It was as if the wind had changed direction, sweeping away loyalties that had been sustained solely by power. In Clara's heart, the transformation was silent but profound. It wasn't just about gaining access to possessions. It was the recognition that her voice, so often ignored, now carried weight. The girl who had been pushed out of the mansion under the snow became, before everyone's eyes, the guardian of part of the Whittaker legacy. And even though there were still battles to be fought, one truth was already established. Power had changed hands. The Whittaker Holdings main boardroom had never been so crowded. The directors, men and women accustomed to silk ties and crystal glasses, expected just another meeting dominated by Gregory and Thomas. But that morning, upon entering the room, they saw Clara sitting at the head of the table, accompanied by Andrew. The silence was almost offensive. Gregory tried to laugh it off, saying it was a misunderstanding, that the chair was reserved for those who truly knew how to lead. No one laughed with him. The meeting began with cold reports, numbers projected on screens, contracts awaiting signature, until Clara took the floor. Her voice didn't tremble, but it carried a firmness no one had recognized. She explained that she had indisputable documents in hand, showed bank records, and presented certified copies of the addendum read in court. When she finished, she looked up and found dozens of surprised gazes, some in disbelief, others already inclined to respect her. For the first time, the weight of her family name was in her favor. Gregory exploded. He stood up, accused her of manipulation, and called Andrew a low-class lawyer. The scene, however, was recorded by discreet cameras in the back of the room, and hours later broadcast in excerpts by the press. The man who had always cultivated the image of a level-headed leader appeared screaming, red-faced, pointing his finger at his own sister. Thomas tried to restrain him, but ended up being ridiculed by repeating the unsubstantiated accusations. What had once been absolute dominance was now a public display. Clara, on the other hand, didn't need to raise her voice. She simply said she wasn't there to destroy, but to fulfill what her parents had written. She declared that wealth shouldn't be a platform for vanity, but rather a source of sustenance for those who depended on it, employees, partners, entire families linked to the companies. Her words echoed in the room louder than her brother's shouts, and when she finished, the silence wasn't one of contempt, but of recognition. Outside, the reversal was even more brutal. Columnists who days before had dismissed her as a shadow now wrote about the dignified posture of the forgotten heiress. Portworkers toasted in bars, laughing at the brothers' desperation. On social media, clips of Gregory's outburst circulated alongside serene images of Clara, creating an impossible-to-distract visual narrative. The leader who lost control, and the youngest who finally assumed the position that had been denied her. The climax came when the press, in large numbers, awaited the brothers at the exit of the meeting. Gregory, accustomed to smiling for the cameras, left with his head down, protected by security. Thomas walked alongside, sweating in the Boston cold. Behind them, Clara passed calmly, waving discreetly to the reporters. The contrast was devastating. Those who should have been invisible were now the center of attention. Those who should have been in charge were now publicly ridiculed. That morning, the humiliation had finally shifted. What Gregory and Thomas had done to their sister in the snow was being mirrored back to them. They had the entire society watching, and for the first time, there was nothing they could say to erase what everyone had seen. That night, Clara returned to her small Cambridge apartment. The space was still the same, peeling walls, the smell of old paint, but she was no longer the same woman who had cried on the cold mattress. Now she carried in her hands not only papers and records, but a decision that haunted her like a shadow: use her newfound power to crush her brothers or choose a path few expected. The memory of the snow still burned, the icy wind, the muffled laughter behind the closed door, the suitcase thrown at her feet. All of it was as vivid as if it had happened hours before. There were nights when she would wake with a start, feeling the same pain, the same feeling of being rejected by the blood that should have protected her. The desire for revenge rose like a scream pent up in her throat. One gesture, one signature, and Gregory and Thomas could be forever removed from any position of power. But there was also another voice inside her, her mother's voice, in the letters and notes she kept, telling her that dignity is not weakness, that compassion is not surrender. The memory of her father, repeating that true character is proven when no one is looking, surfaced every time Clara sat before the documents. It wasn't just about punishing her brothers, it was about choosing what kind of heiress she wanted to be. In the midst of this intimate storm, Gregory appeared at her door. There were no cameras, no journalists, only the man who had always used his surname as a shield, now with red eyes and a trembling voice. He tried to mask it with arrogance, saying that Clara wouldn't understand the responsibility of carrying the family, that the papers were just lawyers' tricks. But when he realized his words wouldn't work, the mask slipped. He quietly begged her not to destroy him completely, to at least preserve his image in the business world. Thomas, days later, did the same. Less theatrical, more resigned, he admitted that they had been too harsh, but that circumstances had forced them. He asked for a chance to remain on the council, even if in a secondary position. Clara listened in silence. The pain was still too deep to yield to immediate pity, but there was no pleasure in their suffering either. Revenge promised temporary relief. Forgiveness promised lasting freedom. At the next council meeting, everyone expected retaliation. Some imagined Clara summarily removing the brothers in front of the cameras, returning the humiliation in kind. Others believed she might surprise them. The room was full of watchful eyes when Clara stood up. In a firm voice, he announced that he did not intend to use his position for personal revenge. He declared that the brothers' mistakes would not be forgotten, but that the company and their parents' legacy were above domestic squabbles. He also said that any future attempt to repeat the humiliation would be met with all legal means, but that at that moment he chose not to retaliate. The silence that followed was absolute. Some advisers bowed discreetly as a sign of respect. Others, incredulous, could not hide their surprise. Clara sat back down, her heart aflame. She knew she hadn't pleased everyone, but she had taken possession of something more valuable than her fortune, the right to define, alone, who she was. No longer the victim, no longer the shadow. By refusing revenge, she had gained a freedom her brothers would never understand. The courtroom was packed again, as if all of Boston had turned out to witness the Whitakers' demise. The dark wood of the benches seemed to absorb the hubbub, and the state crest above the bench served as a reminder that here, a family name was no more important than the law. Clara entered unescorted, with only Andrew at her side. Gregory and Thomas arrived later, surrounded by aides who whispered strategies, as if they still had hidden cards. Judge McPherson called the case to order and requested silence. Her voice held the weight of a decision that could no longer tolerate delays. The first part was technical, reading the independent audit report, confirming that the transfers made by Henry and Eleanor had occurred years earlier, with witnesses and notarized acknowledgements. Then came the bank's sworn statements regarding the Boylston safe deposit box, the account ownership chain, and the automatic activation provided for in the expulsion clause. The dates left no room for error, and the signatures sealed the deal. By the end of the reading, no one doubted that the mechanism had been set up to function exactly as it did. Gregory rose, nevertheless, for one last act. He spoke of family, of honor, of tradition. He said that parents never intended to weaken the natural leadership of their sons. He mentioned his sister's emotional imbalances in a move that reeked of desperation. The judge raised her hand and interrupted, asking him to stick to the facts. He tried to continue. The court official stepped forward. Gregory relented, his fists clenched and his eyes glazed with silent fury. Thomas said nothing. His silence in that moment cost more than any speech. Andrew then asked to speak for a final detail. He removed a letter from Henry from the folder, not an addendum, but a personal text that accompanied the safe, a short note attached to the records in which his father wrote that power is only safe in the hands of those who do not need it to exist. It was not a legal document, but it was a moral light. The judge received the document as one receiving an echo, and without theatrics returned it to the table. She didn't need the letter to make her decision, but upon touching it, she seemed to understand the whole picture. The gavel fell twice. The first time, to fully ratify Clara's ownership of the assets linked to the clause and recognize her right to vote on the relevant boards. The second time, to grant a protective measure against any direct or covert attempt at intimidation, warning that the court would not hesitate to impose sanctions. The sharp sound cut through the room like a razor, cutting through the last shred of doubt. The turnaround, which had been silent until then, became irreversible before everyone's eyes. The press exploded outside, but it was inside the room that the climax reached its climax. Clara stood and asked permission to speak. There was no audience to please, only a truth to be made to stand. She said she did not celebrate defeats, that she would not turn the courtroom into a stage. She also said she rejected the idea that compassion was weakness, and that from that moment on, she would use what she had inherited to support people, not vanity. She spoke of the household staff, the company employees, and the projects her mother dreamed of funding. Her face did not tremble. Her voice did, a tremor that was not fear, but humanity. When she finished, the entire room breathed, as if coming out of water. Gregory and Thomas walked past her without looking at her. The deepest defeat wasn't losing their property. It was accepting that the sister they'd cast out into the cold had returned with something they'd never had: legitimacy. Reporters shouted names, microphones jockeyed for space, but the image that would remain standing would be different. Clara descending the courthouse steps, with firm steps, the old snow crunching under her heels, the city reflected in the metal of the police cars like a rearranged mosaic. On the sidewalk, a cameraman asked her what she would say to someone being pushed out of their own home. Clara thought of the girl shivering on the brownstone sofa, of Eleanor's letter, of her father's words. She replied simply that no one decides the value of a life by the size of the audience, and that winter always ends. There was no applause. There was silence, and, in that silence, the recognition that the story had reached exactly the point it needed to. The climax wasn't a roar. It was the precise containment of a verdict that realigned the world. From then on, the aftershock remained. What would be done with the power? What role each would play? What mark their surname would leave on the city now that the truth had come out of the vault and into the light? And, as the cameras insisted on capturing the triumph, Clara was already thinking about what would come next, because she understood that the end of winter is never the end of the cold. It's the beginning of the thaw. With the judge's gavel still echoing in Boston's collective memory, the Whitakers' lives never returned to where they were. In the days following the verdict, the city seemed to whisper only one name: Clara. The cafes of Beacon Hill, once the scene of malicious comments about her fragility, now cited her as an example of dignity. In the gossip columns, the headlines that once extolled Gregory transformed into analyses of his younger sister's unexpected rise. Even the mansion's servants, many now retired, gathered to remember the girl who was grateful for every gesture, and smiled, knowing that somehow their parents' justice had prevailed. Gregory and Thomas, on the other hand, became shadows of their former selves. Investors withdrew, dinner invitations disappeared, and allies who had once applauded their decisions began to avoid their names. the power they believed. Eternal evaporated in weeks, eroded by their own arrogance. The humiliation they had planned against their sister had returned multiplied, not because Clara had destroyed them, but because society itself saw them for what they truly were. The silence surrounding them was crueler than any revenge. Clara, however, did not celebrate this ruin. She chose to continue living in the simple apartment, at least for a while, as a reminder of the journey. She dedicated herself to reviewing inherited papers, planning social projects her mother dreamed of supporting, and restoring dignity to longtime family employees who had been forgotten. She discovered that the strength she sought lay not in possessing the keys to the mansion, but in how she chose to use them. Power was no longer a burden, it was responsibility. Gradually, her figure ceased to be just news and became a symbol. Schools invited her to speak about courage, foundations requested her presence on boards, young people repeated her name in graduation speeches. She didn't ask for any of this, but she understood that her story offered a lesson that transcended borders, that no one should accept being defined by the contempt of others, that even the longest night can be endured if one believes in one's own worth. When she finally returned to Chestnut Street months later, she didn't enter as someone claiming a throne. She entered as a daughter, remembering her mother's laughter echoing through the halls, her father's voice, telling her that character is the only inheritance that cannot be stolen. She walked through the empty room, touched the wood of the table where she had so often been ignored, and silently gave thanks, not for the inheritance, but for the chance to show that you can't erase those who remain standing. The moral of the story is that there is no triumph of riches, but of dignity. The brothers chose arrogance and reaped loneliness. Clara chose not to return the favor, and discovered that true victory is not in humiliating in return, but in proving that humiliation never defined who you are. The Boston cold continued to blow through the streets, but for Clara, winter was over. And for all who heard her story, it left an indelible lesson. Power loses strength when used to oppress, but flourishes when guided by respect.